Well, I guess where are we in terms of treatment? Because this has been developing. There's all these different essentially all these different treatments out there. There's like huge gradation in terms of how much they cost, how effective they are. I've been hearing that some of them are even kind of negatively effective. Where are we in terms of treatment? And of course, let's talk about both inpatient, which is where you started, and then this outpatient side.
So let's talk about the United States, because I think they're the most absurd example of the deplorable state of where we are with therapeutics. Like, what is officially being practiced and recommended by our health agencies and deployed by our hospitals. The best way to understand it is what you already mentioned, which is the cost. All you need to do is look at the cost of the medicines that are being used right now in this country compared to the 24 compounds that have shown efficacy in trials across the world. Every single agent that's officially met the approval or recommendation by our agencies is extremely high cost. And when I say there's well over 24 compounds shown efficacy, almost all of the others cost less than $5. Not one is recommended in this country, not even vitamin D. So, your question about where are we with therapeutics, it's very hard to answer without getting angry, because where we are with therapeutics is exactly where the system in which we practice leads us. And it's a system which essentially favors and is structured around the regulatory and/or approval of high-profit, patented, novel pharmaceutical industry products. It is a system that systematically, and has for decades, fought against the use of repurposed or generic drugs. And I will tell you, the most effective drugs that we and my organization have identified in this pandemic as being effective in this disease, they're almost all, with maybe the exception of monoclonal antibodies, they're almost all costing less than $5 and have been around for decades. Not one is being approved in this country. I've lately, in my close study of not only COVID and trying to understand and how that system has failed in its response, how the U.S. health system, I've become a close student of that system, and now I see how it works. I now can explain their behaviors, and it's essentially a system which marches in lockstep with the interests of the pharmaceutical industry and to protect their profits. And those behaviors actually, and this is not an overstatement, it's not hyperbole, have now reached a level of crimes against humanity. We already know the pharmaceutical industry has committed crimes over the last decades. I mean, just in the last 2 decades alone, they're up to $6 billion in criminal fines, and that's not counting the crimes of the opioid epidemic. So we know that they're capable of criminal actions, and their criminal actions in suppressing and distorting the science around these low-cost, repurposed drugs have starved people of effective therapeutics, not only in this country, but across the world. And it's led to millions of deaths.
A lot to take in.
Yeah.
Well, so I think when we were speaking earlier, you mentioned to me that hydroxychloroquine was one of the early repurposed drugs which was proposed and has been used since in some places. But I think you told me you yourself were pretty convinced it wouldn't work, but something changed your mind along the way.
Yeah. So we were led to believe, when I say me, myself, my colleagues, I'll say 2 things about what happened with hydroxychloroquine. At that time, myself and my colleagues, when the early formation of my organization, right, the FLCCC, we were really focused. Our first protocol was totally directed at the hospital patient. And hydroxychloroquine was very quickly, we understood that it didn't work in the hospital. And also didn't have a rationale for why it would work in a hospital. It had antiviral properties. Why would you give it 2 weeks into the disease? So we never really had it on our hospital protocol. I think I used it in the first couple of patients, but I was very quickly not impressed with any benefits that I saw, and I was really concerned about that. So we didn't use it. And at the time, as an organization, we were not focused on the outpatient arena because we're all ICU doctors. But I will say that 2020 was what I consider so in this decades-long war on repurposed drugs waged by the pharmaceutical industry, 2020 was the war on hydroxychloroquine. And they basically, through a numbers and series of actions, were able to convince the world's health systems, the medical community of the globe, that hydroxychloroquine was an ineffective and dangerous drug, while the opposite was true. And I will say that we believed some of it. You know, when we saw the negative trials, the only trials that you're showing up in high-impact journals were negative ones, meaning showing that it didn't work or that it was toxic. And so we were influenced, and it's essentially pharmaceutical propaganda that they use medical journals to convince doctors away from repurposed drugs. And that's what happened with hydroxychloroquine. And I have colleagues who fought that war. So colleagues like Dr. Peter McCullough and Dr. Harvey Rich, they knew it worked. They knew that the preponderance evidence showed that it worked. And it was only recently, and I will say that I became convinced based on the preponderance of the evidence about 6 months ago that it was an effective drug. And I disagreed with my colleagues. So Dr. Marek was put a lot more weight on the official published trials in the major medical journals. And it was after reading Bobby Kennedy's book where we learned what they did. And what they did is they designed trials focused only on the hospitalized patient using essentially near-lethal toxic doses of the drug where the treated patients did worse. They died more often than placebo. And using those trials, they convinced the world not to use hydroxychloroquine. And they did that only focusing on the hospital. And so I remember in 2020, when our federal government agencies came up with a policy and they told the entire nation's hospitals and doctors, we are restricting the use of hydroxychloroquine to the hospital. That was a criminal action. That was fraudulent. There was no reason why you would want to restrict it to the hospital. You want to use it early in disease as an antiviral. And not only after they committed those fraudulent trials, and there was fraudulent papers and editorials in the journals that got retracted, but you know, even after you retract something, the damage is already done. So they put fraudulent studies published in major journals like The Lancet, then they retracted them, and they literally prevented outpatient doctors from using it. And after those trials came out, they actually canceled the studies of early treatment. They canceled ongoing trials of early treatment of hydroxychloroquine. So the war on repurposed drugs, 2020 was the war on hydroxychloroquine. 2021 has been the war of ivermectin. That's the war I've had a front row seat, and I've been fighting with every waking moment for the last year. And you know what the war of 2022 is? It's a war on the drug called fluvoxamine, which is an antidepressant, which has potent anti-inflammatory properties, which greatly reduces the risk of death and hospitalization. And by the way, that study, a large, multi-center, double-blind, randomized controlled trial published in The Lancet in November. What have our federal agencies done about that drug and that trial? They have ignored it. It's called crickets. The NIH has specifically avoided updating the recommendation on fluvoxamine, despite it meets the level of evidence which purportedly the system runs on, right? Which is these large double-blind trials done by major academic medical centers. It has that. And the NIH refuses to update their guidance on the drug named fluvoxamine. And I believe, and I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theory, it's not a conspiracy theory. I believe they're ignoring it, and they asked the Infectious Disease Society of America to address it. And you know what the Infectious Disease Society of America did about fluvoxamine in their recommendation? You know how they updated it? They continue to say, do not use outside of a clinical trial. They just did the clinical trial. It was phenomenally effective. And so I'm just bringing up these examples because, you know, for me, although I'm known as an ivermectin expert, an advocate for ivermectin, it's not about ivermectin. It's about the pharmaceutical industry capture of our agencies and how our policies are all directed at suppressing and avoiding use of repurposed drugs. And it has to stop.